Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar. My name's Alec McCutcheon. I'm a Director of Unicom. We're hosting the event today. Our presenter is Andrew Phillips. Andrew has presented several webinars for us, which have always proved extremely popular and engaging. And Andrew's role is President of Product Management for Zebia Labs. The theme today is, what is a deployment automation tool and how can it help me? So I will hand over without further ado to Andrew, and before just mentioning that we also have the opportunity for questions at the end of the webinar. I hope you enjoy it, and Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alec. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to join here. As Alec mentioned, I am indeed the VP Products for Zebia Labs, although if you've been watching for the past couple of seconds, you'll have seen me mainly struggling with PowerPoint, so we'll see how that goes for the remainder of this session. Long story short, I'm not going to spend much of our valuable time doing the me slide, but I've been on the dev and ops side of the fence, and I come from a development background, built a bunch of pretty interesting systems, though I say so myself. And I think the last couple of years obviously have been focused primarily on building enterprise tools for DevOps and continuous delivery, with specifically deployment automation as one of the key things that we tackle as Zebia Labs. So before we dive into the meat of the webinar, just a couple of housekeeping slides. If you're familiar with the Unicom webinars, you'll know this already. So we're using GoToWebinar. If you have questions, feel free to type them into the questions tab at any point. If we get round to having a Q&A session at the end, and I very much hope we do, then we'll be picking some of those. Rest assured, if your question doesn't get answered for some reason, we will be following up with you after the webinar to make sure nobody's questions are left unanswered overall. There will be a recording of the webinar that will be sent around, so you don't need to take copious notes, although of course I'm very flattered if you would like to do that. And with that, let's move on from the housekeeping. So the agenda for today, well, I mean, the title of the talk is, what is a deployment automation tool and how can it help me? And well, we'll start out by sketching out a little bit what I consider for the purposes of this talk a deployment tool to be, and then obviously moving on to the next interesting question. There are a ton of different ways to solve this particular problem. When does it make sense for me to actually think about looking at a deployment automation tool as part of my overall CD DevOps toolkit, if you like? Having decided that that may make sense, what do these tools currently commonly get integrated with? What are you seeing out there? Which combinations make sense? Which combinations make somewhat less sense? So we'll talk about some common integration patterns. And then we'll round it off with some next steps. What can I do now? What's a useful way to get started thinking about this problem? And we'll round off with some questions, as we said. We'll try and make this as short and sweet as possible, give everybody some time to get back to their breakfast, lunch, or dinner, but of course we want to make sure we cover the points in sufficient detail. So, I said that the first section was going to be what is a deployment tool actually, and it's very hard to address that particular question if we don't clarify for the purposes again of this talk what we actually mean by a deployment. There's a whole bunch of different terms that are used in this space. I would say that the most common like synonym, if you like, or the most common other term that's used when people talk about releases. We at Labs, if you look at our product line and the way we use the terms, we think of a release as being somewhat bigger, as going, if you like, all the way from dev to production. When we talk about a deployment, we really mean I need to get application version X, so that might be version 3.5 of my mobile app, or version 4.8 of my web content, or version 8.5 of my app, running in a particular environment. So that might be my dev environment, my test environment, my QA environment, my production environment, something like that. Now, I've written application here, but of course, if we think about this a little more deeply, then applications are by far from being the only things that we're going to be releasing like this or deploying like this on a regular basis. There you go, tripped over my own definition there. Most of the time, the concept is really about a version deliverable, something you can point to that contains a bunch of components that need to be deployed and that has a version number attached to it. So you might say version 3.5 of my configuration or my content for my CMS, for instance, which isn't really an application, but equally a version deliverable. Or you might talk about having a configuration version for maybe a target environment, especially if you're working with some of the more enterprisey middleware stacks such as WebSphere or WebLogic. You can also think of the configuration that goes in there as being a version deliverable. And another thing that we're going to talk about in quite a lot more detail in a second is that, of course, the scope of this deliverable varies widely, and this is what makes the choice in this area somewhat interesting. We have delivery models from a kind of full stack perspective, which of course now with Docker and Rocket and containers is going through yet another renaissance. You also have more, if you like, deliverables that are more focused on what you would classically consider to be application tier components, such as ER files, WAR files, ASP, or the .NET applications, that kind of stuff. Right, I touched on this a little bit already in what I just said, but one of the things that makes deployment as a topic interesting right now is that there are rather different scopes of the kind of things that can be delivered here. And I guess the two ends of the spectrum that we're talking about is the full stack, or what I call the virtual appliance spectrum, or end of the spectrum on the one side, and the more kind of PaaS style end of the spectrum on the other side. So the idea here is that in the virtual appliance world, basically what you're delivering, what's coming out of your kind of build CI stream and what you pick up and then put in an environment is pretty much the entire environment itself. Of course, you're not likely to deploy a hypervisor every single time, but you might say, look, what I'm going to spin up when I hit this particular button is 4 servers. They're all networked together. Each server is configured in a certain way and has a whole bunch of code running on it, and they're linked up in certain ways. So to all intents and purposes, you're basically standing up an entire stack in one go. Obviously, with things like containers, this is becoming hugely popular again, but it's really nothing new. This is what we've been doing with virtual appliances for ages, and of course mainframes before that as well. Whenever you download a big IP virtual appliance or something like that, you're basically doing a kind of full stack delivery model. You get a pretty big deliverable, and it contains everything that it needs to run. In that world, deployment itself, the actual action of deploying this particular thing can be relatively easy because there's not much to do beyond boot it up and maybe link it to other parts of your landscape. For instance, your load balances and those kind of things typically still need to be hooked up. But there are a whole bunch of management challenges that go with it, both from a sort of traceability, auditability perspective, and indeed now with microservices from a dependency perspective. But I'll talk about those more in a little bit. The other end of the spectrum, if you like, so going from the, I'm going to give you this big deliverable that contains everything, is what has been popular in various guises, but now I guess is back at the kind of PaaS view, where you have a relatively powerful and, if you like, high-level runtime platform that encapsulates what you might consider middleware or something like that. And then what gets delivered onto that PaaS or onto that platform is a relatively thin piece that really is just business logic, application-specific code, maybe a little bit of configuration. And the PaaS does all the heavy lifting of figuring out how to get that stuff actually running, what kind of app servers or other runtimes need to be instantiated for this thing, how it needs to be hooked up to web traffic, how you handle things like scaling, logging, monitoring, all that kind of stuff is given to you by the platform. But that, on the other hand, means that the platform has to be pretty powerful and pretty complex. Well, a lot of people now are obviously looking at sort of building something like a PaaS on top of a container spec or on top of a bunch of other tools. And this is exactly where some pretty complex deployment logic often comes in. Even though you may not call it that, every PaaS, of course, has a deployment engine built inside it that allows you to distribute the application. So these are two ends of a spectrum. But of course, everything in between is possible, right? It is not either virtual appliance or PaaS. Really, what we're talking about in general is where does the boundary lie between what I consider to be, if you like, the runtime and what the application team or what the development team delivers. So even in the kind of PaaS, even in the virtual appliance world, of course, there is a notion of a runtime. It's typically either a physical server or a hypervisor or something like that. You're not going to reinstall that every time, of course. And one thing to bear in mind here is that this kind of trade-off, or where you decide to place the boundary between the platform and the application deliverable, may vary within your organization quite widely across different technologies, across different teams. So it's certainly not as though we as a team or as an organization are going to choose one approach and that's going to be it for everything. And actually having tooling that can handle kind of diversity at this level is, of course, an important one to bear in mind. So that's having talked a little bit about different styles of things that we can deliver. But one thing, another point to bear in mind when we look at that original definition, getting an application X running in environment Y, is that you typically, for a given application, will not do this just once. I mean, it's not like you only have the production environment. For maybe 99% of people listening, you don't only have a production environment. So you will be actually taking this particular deliverable and you will be instantiating it multiple times, or in other words, you'll be deploying it multiple times as it makes its way from development through to production. If you've got a full stack deliverable, you're not really deploying it to multiple environments, you're probably instantiating it multiple times. But the subsequent comments hold even for those kind of models. They're all going to be a little bit different in general. And I think this has been something that we've been trying to get rid of or get away from a best practice perspective for ages. Ideally, you want to use production-like environments all the time because, of course, it gives you much better kind of predictability and confidence that the results you're getting from, for instance, testing will carry over to production. But the reality has always been, so far at least, that the dev and the test environments tend to be a little bit more lightweight. They have different kind of sizings. They have different kind of maybe hardware that they're running on. There's different orchestration patterns that get applied when you deploy them. So while in a test environment, it doesn't matter if you kill all the servers and then boot them up, and so the test environment's not available for a couple of minutes, big deal. In the production environment, it's a totally different story. You typically want to do something like a hot deployment or a blue-green deployment or something along those lines. So you also need to think, if you're thinking in terms of deployment tooling, you also need to think of tooling that can handle not only this variation from dev to prod in a reasonably seamless manner, but can also handle the different kind of orchestration patterns that are required as you do this, without hopefully you having to explicitly write a script for every environment. I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So yeah, from a deployment perspective, it is a pipeline, and think about what changes as you go from end to end. One final point, I guess, to mention on this from the pass view, of course, is that so one of the things that often gets touted as being a benefit of the pass is that because it's the same quote-unquote pass all the way down the line, you will have more production-like environments even in early stage. So your test environment or QA environment will look more production-like, and that's certainly something to bear in mind as we go forward. So to address I can hardly say the elephant in the room, because this is really the total opposite of that, maybe the sort of the ant colony in the room. How does this relate, when we talk about deployment, how does this relate to things like microservices, containers? Docker, now Rocket, unsurprisingly, there's a new contender, and I'm sure in a couple of weeks or months there'll be yet another one. That's the nature of the game, I guess. One of the questions that we hear very, very often, or we've heard very often in the past couple of months, is, so surely in this microservices world, or specifically with Docker, all this stuff just goes away. We don't have any of these challenges anymore. And it's certainly true that if you look at a microservices type approach, and I'm deliberately going away from any particular implementation technology because, again, this is not new stuff. We've been talking about this kind of architectural pattern for decades now almost, and the trend has gone up and down on this one, of course, but how you happen to implement your microservices setup, whether you use containers or whether you just have simple Jetty applications running on a server or whether you use a pass, really doesn't matter all that much, I think, from the perspective of this discussion. Long story short, deploying one of these individual components, of course, becomes a lot more simple because the components themselves are a lot more simple. The idea behind services or microservices is that they're very trivial, if you like, almost applications, not functionality-wise, but from their complexity. So the challenge isn't really how do I get one of these individual microservice container thingies running, because you hardly ever have just one of them. in your microservices environment, your Friday afternoon or whenever your release kicks off isn't about, I need to get this one service running. It's about, I need to get 57 of 124 services running. And I need to figure out whether they've been tested in combination. I need to figure out whether they will be compatible with what's currently running in production, whether there's no other releases scheduled that try to update other services in production in ways that will conflict with what I'm doing. So the real challenge moves from what's going on within this individual deliverable. How does the database update work with the web server update, work with the app server update, that kind of stuff. It goes in the direction of managing the relationships and the dependencies between the services. So ironically enough, this is something that I've had a couple of people point out to me, and I've noticed it as well, is we're really taking a lot of the dependency problems that we've spent many years trying to solve at build time, if you think of like Maven, dependency management, how to make sure your app is built using the same libraries and all that kind of stuff, and we're moving them out to runtime. But of course, that means that you need tooling that can address this particular problem at runtime rather than at build time. So I think the good news in this particular landscape is that the underlying technical features that are required in order to address these new challenges are pretty much the same. Because if you think about it, in order to deploy the one big application properly, you also need to be aware of dependencies amongst its components, and you need to be able to orchestrate these in a suitable way. But that underlying technical similarity doesn't necessarily carry over to the domain level, if you like. If you look at, certainly if you look at deployment tools that fundamentally have an interface or a model where you can define an application and you can define some kind of plan or generate some kind of plan to get that application deployed. In a microservices world, you suddenly need to be able to support not just one complex application and one complex environment, but many, many, many deployments of many different applications at the same time. So if you like, the requirement at the tooling level shifts from, does this tool support all the components of the particular big app that I have, to how easy is it in this particular tool to run a whole bunch of deployments at the same time if they have dependencies amongst each other. All right, so having spent a bunch of time now talking about deployment and giving some nuances in terms of different types of delivery models, that deployments often happen in a sequence, and that things are changing a little bit when we're talking about microservices and IoT kind of environments. Let's look at what a deployment tool would be then, once I've got this definition out of the way. So first, a little bit of boring nomenclature. Again, as with any field, there doesn't seem to be one name for these kind of things. You'll hear people talking about deployment tools. You'll hear people talking about deployment automation tools. Gartner terms them application release automation, or ARA tools, which is a little confusing because now there's this entire other class of release tooling, which is more like continuous delivery pipeline management. But those are kind of terms that you're going to hear in this space. And of course, the trivial definition is, well, if we start by saying a deployment is getting application X running in environment Y, then a deployment tool is a tool that gets application X running in environment Y in an automatic, or let's be a little realistic, largely automatic way for many different X and Y. And I think that's an important piece. That gets back to some of the points we just discussed. Maybe I have to deploy multiple applications at the same time. And of course, I have to be aware that application X will have to go not just to the dev environment, but to the acceptance and the staging and the pre-production and the production environment. And those processes should, of course, happen in a reasonably kind of homogeneous way. So some key points about deployment automation tools that I certainly think are worth bearing in mind if you're considering these, and how to characterize them. The first is that what they're doing really is coordinating actions across multiple target systems. That's especially true in the kind of big app world, if you like, where you have a database update happening over here, and you have a change to your web server configuration, maybe a new rewrite rule happening over there, and then you have a configuration change to your app server and the app server code update, and maybe you need to mess around with the load balancer and all that kind of stuff. So you need to coordinate this across multiple systems. In a microservices world, this is also coordinating actions, but then coordinating actions relating to multiple different microservices. Well, that's, I think, the fourth bullet point here pretty much. ensuring that you can handle this problem of environment independence and a relatively smooth progression from development to production, I think that's also very much a key piece of functionality that the deployment tool should make available. So from a continuous delivery best practice perspective, you should not be having to build different deliverables for dev, test, acceptance, QA, and so on environments. You should really be having one deliverable that can kind of be promoted from dev all the way through to production. But of course, as we said earlier, these environments tend to be ever so slightly different, so you somehow need a nice way of identifying that difference. That sounds very fancy. Typically what this means is supporting some kind of tokenization. But you also, you need good support for this kind of tokenization in the tool and for relatively transparent application of changes, so that as you go from dev to QA to acceptance to production, the right values get used and you don't have to like unzip all kinds of files yourself in order to replace values in order to make this work. Well, ultimately, of course, every tool, certainly in the DevOps landscape, is just code. So if you wanted to, you can script all this stuff yourself, of course, just like you can script anything pretty much. But what a deployment tool should give you is a bit of the reduction of the need to do this. Yes, if you want to do some custom stuff, you definitely have to have the flexibility to do this. But in general, you hopefully do not need to use custom stuff to handle very, very simple questions such as, how do I get an EA file running in this particular app server, or how do I instantiate a Docker container, or all that kind of stuff. You don't really want to be having to write that yourself. There should be some rich kind of out-of-the-box content to make this problem go away, because it's just an annoying maintenance problem that you don't really want to be left with. Well, I already touched a little bit on the multiple interdependent deployments a couple of times now, so let's not go into that in more detail. But I think the other thing that's important, and this is a little bit, one of my colleagues termed this the kind of the grumpy old man set of features. I think the reality, even for me, has been that many times I've thought that this new technology, this new paradigm, this whatever, is going to make all these boring enterprise problems just go away because it's just smarter and better, and we finally thought of a way to banish these demons forever. And the reality has always been that that's just not true. If you're working, once you get to a more than trivial level of complexity with your team or your company or whatever, certain challenges keep coming up again and again and again. And those are pretty boring in general, but they're just always there. There are things like auditability, separation of duties, visibility, reporting, etc., etc. Really boring stuff, but I don't think it helps anyone. It certainly hasn't helped me in the past to kind of close my eyes to them and hope that they would just go away if I didn't look. And so I think it's very important that if you think about deployment tooling, or at least deployment tooling that will grow with your teams and your organization, that these kind of questions and these kind of requirements are handled, or easy to handle when you get to them. Because it's not really a question of if you'll get to them, but when you'll get to them. We'll talk more about that in a little bit of a second. So that's been an attempt to sketch what a deployment tool roughly does, how you would characterize it, what things to look out for when you're thinking about a deployment tool. And now the next question that we typically get asked is, well, there's a ton of different tools out there in my DevOps landscape. Most likely I have 3 or 4 of these already running in my environment. I've used these kind of tools for deployment in the past. Why don't I just, or can I just use these in the future? So there's a list here. It's by no means exhaustive. I think we had an entire other webinar about this topic, trying to put together a bit of a taxonomy for this entire tool space. But some of the ones that come up really frequently are, of course, things like, well, I'm doing this in Jenkins, or I'm doing this in Bamboo, or I'm doing this with Puppet or Chef, and of course the messaging in that area is very encouraging in terms of asking you to try to do application deployment in a provisioning tool. And then I think what we're seeing is a little bit of a kind of level setting at that level, more and more interest in task executors or orchestrators such as Ansible, and formerly Rundeck, and of course there's a bunch of others, plus all the cloud container management tools such as the RightScale, the ElasticBoxes, the OpenStack Heats, the OpsWorks, the list just goes on and on in that particular space. And I think the answer to that question, whether these tools can't solve a problem perfectly well, is that, well, of course they can in certain contexts. and with certain with certain restrictions or certain compromises that you're willing to make. Because fundamentally, all these tools ultimately will allow you to run stuff on machines. So it's not the sort of Turing completeness here. Each of these tools can do what the others do, but are they well suited to your particular setup is, I think, what the big question is. And then we'll talk about two metrics that we've kind of used in the past in a little bit, deployment complexity and future insurance. But let's tackle some of the common questions head-to-head first. So the first is, I've done this in Jenkins, or I want to do this in Jenkins. I know lots of my friends do this in Jenkins. Why not just do that? And again, don't take these answers as in it's not possible. Of course it's possible, but it may not be the best fit for your organization or your challenge. One of the things that commonly comes up, these are, well, we'll talk about the big problem, if you like, in a second, but some of the little niggles that people start to notice. First of all, that there's a bit of a domain model mismatch. Because deployment, whether it's of the microservices flavor or the kind of big app flavor, is about coordinating individual actions with different components of your app across different machines. And that's really not at all what a CI server is designed to do. A CI server is supposed to take a unit of work, a build job, and make it run wherever it has capacity. So the idea is that, well, I have 100 build slaves and all of them have, I don't know, the right version of the CLR, or they have the right version of Java or whatever installed. So it doesn't matter where I dispatch this job. And this is perfect for the kind of load balancing capacity that a CI server is supposed to do. But that's totally not what an application deployment is about. An application deployment is about, I have these 27 steps, and they need to happen in a precisely coordinated sequence on precisely these machines. So you need to come up with some creative way of solving this in CI servers. And suffice it to say that most of the ways are not particularly pleasant, certainly as you start to scale them up. Another challenge that comes up reasonably often is that there's little visibility or insight into what's actually running where. CI servers tend to be very task-oriented in the sense that they get something done, and then maybe as a result, you have some artifacts. That's what they're pretty good at visualizing. But the idea that a particular job actually executes a deployment, and that means that you have a particular version of an application running in a certain environment, is not something that's part of like the domain model, the knowledge, if you like, of CI servers. Exception here would be Bamboo to some extent, because I think they've done a really nice job of visualizing this particular piece. But in general, most of the CI servers you pick up will not give you an easy way to find out what's running where, which from a deployment perspective is a really trivial and common question. Separation of duties is one that comes up more and more. It's all very well to have a CD pipeline or a CI pipeline that goes to, say, your QA environment. You have control over those machines. You can get the build agents running in there. Nobody asks too many questions. But once you start saying, can we put like Jenkins node or Jenkins agents on my production boxes, and how do we make sure that we don't happen to accidentally be running a build on those boxes, then it starts to get a little more interesting. So especially if you're looking to have like one instance, a CI server that also does deployment, of course, a lot of your developers will have access to your CI server because that's what it's really good at doing, continuous integration. So typically people then either come up with pretty complicated permission schemes, or they have actually a different instance of the CI server, at which point they're really just using it as a task orchestrator. But I think the biggest factor here alongside those is really the choice boils down to whether you want to script deployments yourself or whether you want to have some support from out-of-the-box content. And I think the CI servers are great at what they do. They have tons of out-of-the-box plugins and content for pretty much anything you could imagine doing with code. But in terms of actually supporting application deployments, they only have most basic support for, well, I can push this WAR file to, I don't know, Amazon Elastic Beanstalk or something like that. To actually do anything that approaches like a real app deployment in your own environment, you basically end up scripting it. It's a lot of run this script, run that script, then run that script, which is fine, but it's basically scripting. And we'll talk about the complexity in a second and why you should maybe consider whether that's necessarily the best choice for your team. And let me say this at this point. If your scripting consists of one single line, copy file to machine done, then of course this will work absolutely beautifully from a scripting versus out-of-the-box content perspective. But take the announcement of Rocket. So now everybody who's been playing with Docker may now want to look at Rocket. it's pretty nice to have a tool that has Rocket support kind of already out of the box. And if you want to try Rocket, you just take the same app you have, you drop it on a Rocket API or whatever, and then it works. And no scripting required. How about just using a provisioning tool? It's, again, a very common thing. And again, the reality is that this can work pretty well for you if you have the kind of application architecture that matches the model that's pretty much required by provisioning tools, which is that it's reasonably idempotent, and you don't have a strong notion of dependencies. Sorry about that. You don't have a strong notion of dependencies between the individual machines. Some of the challenges we see people talking about here is that asking developers to provide kind of manifests or cookbooks or those kind of things can be a bit of a learning curve. It's not necessarily the most easy thing for a developer to comprehend. And most of the content of provisioning tools, unsurprisingly, since they're about provisioning, is at installing what you might consider middleware. At the app tier, you're pretty much scripting most of it, again, yourself, either writing your own modules or recipes or those kind of things, or you're just having a lot of file exec kind of commands. Provisioning tools are very well suited to, or much better suited, if you like, to full stack setups, because you're really delivering the entire stack. It doesn't work so nicely with a pass view. We've talked to a bunch of people who've tried to do this by telling developers, please don't, please import all these like middleware definitions and don't touch them. But that's a very clunky way of saying, I'm going to give you a pass and please make sure you don't mess around in it. And more often than not, they have to resort to some kind of validation, either automatic or manual, to make sure that developers really don't mess up here. And I mean, there's if you're talking about virtual appliance style delivery, certainly in the microservices landscape where you need to do lots of little individual ones, provisioning tools also tend not to be so great at the sort of multi-machine glue, like linking the networking of different machines together on the fly, or registering them as a unit with a load balancer or that kind of stuff. But I think the biggest factor again here is that, well, the entire background of provisioning tools is, I have 1,000 machines, I need to make them look like this, go make it happen. The notion that there is potentially complex dependencies between what needs to happen on the individual machines is not baked into this model at all. And that's really, I think, if you look at some of the community discussions and the LinkedIn threads and the meetup topics, people are realizing that this doesn't really work well in a provisioning tool. So what a lot of people are doing now is they're gluing a kind of orchestrator on top of a provisioning tool to try to handle precisely this problem. And of course, the vendors of provisioning tools are aware of this and they will come up with the solution at some point in time, but this is a little late in the game, if you ask me. So, having talked about CI servers and provisioning tools, let's now focus on, okay, so maybe you've convinced me, you win, I'm going to look at an orchestrator. Something that is sort of dedicated to actually doing multi-machine orchestration. So what are the things that I should consider here when I do this? So yeah, shall I pick Ansible or Rundeck, or shall I try out something like XL Deploy that's a little more, go a little more, let's not do the straight head-to-head, that has a few more features, if you like. And I think the important thing to bear in mind here is your deployment complexity. How complex is your landscape, and depending on that value, you're going to maybe make different choices. So there are multiple different ways to try to quantify the notion of how complex your deployment landscape is. Some of the sort of dimensions that we commonly use are, how many apps do I have? How different are these applications from each other? How many environments do I have? What's the kind of difference in environments from dev to prod within a single application, but then of course also how many different types of target environments do I have? Do I have like a couple of old legacy systems and then a whole bunch of sort of reasonably modern stuff and now the container world? Or am I standardizing on a pass where I only have one type of target platform? How many steps are in my deployments, in my individual deployment plans? In other words, how complicated are they? How many components are in the applications that I'm deploying? Or if you're doing a kind of microservices approach, how many different microservices am I having to deploy together as a unit with dependencies between them? I think what matters here is not so much how you exactly chain these together in a formula, or what the precise number is. We have complexity 412 versus 372. That's really not that important. But a bit like kind of the estimation, like the agile planning game. What really matters here is that once you start to think about each of these dimensions and you realize that we have non-trivial numbers for any of these, then you start to see that if you're going to look at providing a deployment solution, there's a whole bunch of different factors that this deployment solution needs to somehow address in a reasonably transparent way without requiring a lot of tweaking and hand-holding from your side, because each of these dimensions can require just a little bit of extra custom scripting. And you may not often see this because, if you have 200 different applications and you say the responsibility of writing that little bit of custom scripting lies with the teams, then you have spread this load across 200 different teams, but the load is there all the same. And the load is there when you get a new platform, the load is there when you have to maintain it, when there's a new version, etc., etc., etc. So just because you don't necessarily see this concentrated in one place, there can be a substantial amount of overhead involved with any solution that is really based ultimately on custom scripting. And I think deployment complexity is a good way to try to get a bit of an insight into how big that overhead may be and whether that's something that you as an organization are willing to accept. And I think the other thing, I've spoken about this already up until now, is the whole future insurance kind of idea. So, of course, if you just look at the basic technical requirements, I need to run 300 different steps on these machines, and I need to support Windows and Unix, or I need to support these particular flavors of Unix. Maybe I have a mainframe. We can get all that kind of technical stuff done because, as I've said a few times already, at the fundamental level, all the tools that we've mentioned in this space are pretty much remote orchestrators or remote executors. They will take commands of some nature and run them on a bunch of different target machines. So they can ultimately all pretty much do the same thing. What varies is, not just what's the level of out-of-the-box content that's provided for the task that I need to do all the time, but also the requirements that are not purely technical. And so this goes back to the kind of grumpy old man stuff that I was talking about. My experience, as I said, is not that, oh, well, hopefully this time we've done it right and we don't have auditability as a concern. That just goes away. Of course it doesn't. If you're running in, it goes away if you're starting up with 5 people and you have a couple of servers on Amazon, then yeah, maybe it's not such a big deal. And it also doesn't rear its head if you're starting out with this new kind of skunkworks project and you've got an early adopter team and they're in the development environment and they don't have to bother with the kind of production regulations or all those kind of things. Yes, then for sure this problem probably doesn't exist and is not rearing its head yet. But I think the reality for most people I've spoken to in pretty much any field of IT is that as you grow, and I guess that's what we're all trying to do. We want to grow these initiatives. If you're starting out as a new company, you want to grow beyond 5 people. You want to grow to 50 or 500 or whatever. Or if you're starting out this initiative as a small team, then you of course want it not just to be confined to this one little island in your organization. You want to roll this out broadly so that all the teams can benefit from this. And once you get to the point where you're achieving that kind of level of growth, all these things always come back. There's just, how many times have I hoped that I could somehow avoid them, and it's just never happened. Auditability, compliance. You have to prove to people that the stuff that you did on those machines was the right stuff and that it was signed off by the right people and that, people can't do things in this setup that aren't tracked, etc., etc. Insight and visibility. People don't just want to have automation that does its thing but really doesn't tell anybody much about what it's done. People want to be able to follow the progress of these things. They want it to be integrated into all kinds of other dashboards. They want to ask questions like what versions are running where, or what versions will be running where tomorrow, or what versions were running in the production environment a couple of weeks or months ago when we had that particular issue. There's all kinds of reporting requirements that always keep creeping up. One of the ones that I was confronted with recently, which I think is actually a very legitimate and interesting reporting use case, is a metrics team at a particular customer of ours saying, all very nice that you guys drink the continuous delivery Kool-Aid, but frankly, we're not, until you can prove to us that it works better than cowboy coding and throwing stuff over the wall, we're not buying any of it. So they want to measure, everything that goes on, how long deployments take, how much handover time there is, what the percentage of failures is, all that kind of stuff. And of course, that measurement doesn't just extend to the deployment tool itself, but much broader in the pipeline. Scalability. Yeah, if you're starting out initially, if you've got a handful of servers, then probably you've reached the scale setup. If you're growing really fast, you'll run into the scalability problem really quickly, and you'll get to situations where you have, you're trying to do global deployments, for instance, across different data centers where the connectivity between those data centers isn't great. And you don't want to have a single controller that somehow has to rely on continuous, reasonably high bandwidth network connectivity between those various islands in which you're doing the deployment. Not something that you'll have a problem with immediately, as I said, but certainly something that will rear its head sooner or later. And then you get the infamous ease of use for non-experts question. And I mean, this ties back a little to some of the comments we're hearing often about things like Puppet and Chef being reasonably hard to learn, requiring quite a level of like skill and understanding to get your head around. When you're starting out with that early adopter team, or when you're in that startup with the 5 smart girls and guys, they'll understand pretty much any technology. The challenge isn't to get them to understand the technology. The challenge is, what do you do when you have a bunch of new employees who come on whose speciality is not DevOps and who still need to be able to do their application deployments really easily, and who don't want to have to go onto a training course to learn the latest and greatest new underlying technology or whatever. It needs to be easy for them to use as well. And so these are all these kind of things that always come back, and I call this kind of future insurance, because the question to me is really, can you afford to, of course you can add all this to any kind of basic orchestrator. We've spoken to a bunch of people recently who have a whole ton of interesting inventory scripts and visualization scripts and Kibana dashboards and all kinds of things on top of Ansible in that particular case. But of course they have to build all those. And the point is, right at the moment where your team is trying to accelerate to top speed and your business is growing like as fast as you want it to grow, try not to use any contentious terms on air, that's when you don't want your team to have to go away and build a dashboard for some kind of boring deployment reporting or deployment visibility. So a question that then often comes back, and justifiably so, is, isn't this just premature optimization? Surely we can tackle that problem when we get to it. And I think the answer is no. At least I certainly believe it's no, because premature optimization implies that you're making some kind of trade-off in which you're losing one angle in order to optimize for a case that you think hypothetically may show up in the future. Typically when you're doing code development, you're like unrolling loops and doing all that kind of stuff, and you're losing simplicity of your code, you're losing clarity in order to try to optimize for a case that hasn't proven to be a problem yet. And I think the difference in this case is twofold. First of all, in general, you're not losing anything. There's a whole bunch of tools you can try that support all the basic stuff and then all the other future insurance stuff as well. And the other thing, it's not a hypothetical use case. So far, at least, history seems to show that this use case is very real. So unless you're planning not to grow your team or your initiative or your organization, you will run into this problem sooner or later. So I look at this more like insurance than as a premature optimization. The last thing you want is to realize you don't have fire insurance when that pot goes on fire on the stove in your kitchen. You just make sure you get this done before you hit that particular point. Common integration patterns. I'm going to have to speed up now. So this is an example from our particular tool, but let's have a look at some of the basic things that we see. What are the common integration patterns that we see tools integrating with? So we have pipeline orchestrators and CI servers. Of course, we have integrations with the middleware itself, because the target middleware is what the deployment tool is deploying to, but I don't really consider that an integration. That's more, that's the target landscape. But when people introduce deployment tools into their environment, they obviously want to link it up to their pipeline or their CI server, so that once you've built your code, you can go and actually have it deployed somewhere for you easily, just like you can have it running in a pass, or you can do that one-line file copy. Provisioning tools and cloud platforms. So this is a kind of, there's two main strands of integration that we see here. One is, I've got a provisioning tool, I'm using it for what it's really good at, which is standing up new machines, standing up new environments, or a cloud platform to do something similar. But then, of course, I want to make sure that I can use these in new environments from my deployment tooling. And the last thing I want to do is to have to do the horrible copy-paste glue work where I say, okay, well, I can now find out what the IP addresses are of all those new servers I've created. So let me copy-paste those into my deployment tool so that my deployment tool can deploy to them. You want that problem to just go away, and the typical integration is one of two ways. Either you have the deployment tool actually triggering your provisioning or your cloud tools directly and then pulling back all the information it needs to target that environment, or you set it up so that your provisioning and cloud platforms do their thing triggered by a different source, maybe a monitoring system or maybe just a service request catalog. But when they're done, they will auto-register whatever they've created with their deployment tools so that, again, those environments are ready for use automatically. And then from a slightly less technical perspective, some of the sort of change release management tools come into play quite often here. Things like, before I kick off this deployment, I really want to make sure that I verified that I have a change ticket and it's been approved by the right person and the time window matches and all these kind of things. We see a lot of people doing that with our deployment tool specifically, with people integrating with things like ServiceNow or Remedy or whatever. But more and more, as people are starting to put this into a continuous delivery pipeline, this kind of check goes into the continuous delivery pipeline orchestration. So it's the step before the deployment step, if you like, is to check whether all your conditions have been met for the deployment to actually kick off. And then, of course, you get CMDBs and other systems of record, things like configuration databases or Excel spreadsheets or all that good kind of stuff. Our deployment tool ultimately is making changes to your target landscape. And to try to solve some of these insight issues, of course, people want to make sure that they update their systems of record to know that the version of Pet Clinic running in the dev environment, for instance, or the QA environment is no longer 1.6, but it's now 1.8. And that, the last thing you want to do is to rely on someone at the end of a stressful release Friday to do that manually. You want to make sure that your deployment tools do this automatically. So to give you a bit of this is a small subset of the overall environment. Just wanted to also give you a sketch of how a lot of our users see this commonly integrated into the kind of bigger picture of their DevOps or CD environment, where you'd have your deployment tool, which would be XL deploy there, but you'd also have like a pipeline orchestrator, and then the whole question of testing, which we haven't really touched on today, but they of course play a role together in order to make your application landscape work. So in terms of some next steps, while we have a real life fire going on somewhere around here, I think the first thing to do, if you want to move away from this and say, so okay, that was very interesting, but what can I do now? Try to gain an understanding of your deployment complexity, and not just your setup today, but what you envisage having in 6 months or a year down the line. And don't necessarily go down all those particular metrics, but think about some of them and try to get a feel for, am I in a reasonably simple environment? Am I moving towards a very simple environment? Or am I actually in a moderately complex space? And coupled with that, try to get an idea of how much development and maintenance effort is going into maintaining and keeping your current deployment solution up to date and making it fit for purpose as you move forward to maybe a new landscape. Of course, if your current deployment approach is we have an Excel spreadsheet or we do this from Confluence, then that's pretty clear that there's not that much maintenance, but just a lot of error-prone manual effort. But if you have a setup right now, try to get a bit of a picture for where the work is being done to keep that running. If you're looking at a move towards microservices, you're experimenting with containers, bear in mind the kind of shift in challenges and complexity that comes with this. And there are two common approaches we see people addressing. One is to say, this is the new world, the brand new world, I've called it here to avoid references. We're going to build an entire new tool set that will be beautiful and shiny for this new environment, and we're just going to hope that all the old stuff never rears its head again. We'll consign that to the dustbin of legacy. Versus thinking, okay, well, maybe this is going to be an experiment. Is there some way in which we can have a sort of tool set or a platform that allows us to try microservices from the same kind of interface as we can work with our existing big applications, and that can handle both the, if you like, the complexity within a big app and the kind of complexities that exist in a microservices environment in a reasonably transparent way. Think about your need for future insurance. Of course, I try to describe that certainly in my experience there is definitely a need there, but contexts are different, scenarios are different. At least bear it in mind. So think about what is going to happen with the stuff that you deliver as it moves forward, especially if you're on a project team right now and it will be handed over to somebody else in the future. And if you do decide to try out a deployment tool after all this, obviously make sure that you don't just put it through its paces for the deployment part itself, but figure out how easy it is to link it up to the remainder of your landscape, to your CI service, to your provisioning tools, to your cloud management platforms, to all the other things that you want to link it up to, in order to see how much glue is involved, how nice and seamless or not these integrations really are, and how well it fits into the overall picture. In terms of what we can do, we can have a whole lengthy discussion about what ZBA Labs does specifically, but you can download our tools. XL Deploy is our application deployment tool, and XL Release is more of our pipeline orchestration tool. You can kick the tires on those two straight away, learn more about what we do, or indeed have a look at some of the things that we write about, the things we tweet about, what we find interesting out there in that space, and hopefully I look forward to continuing the engagement going forward. So with that, I'd like to say yes, thank you very much for listening so far. Over to you, and it's time for some questions right now. Let me try and dig out my question panel here. There we go. What do we have coming here? So, all right. Let's have a look at the first question. Let's do these a little bit line by line. I'm going to just make my question pane a little bigger so I can actually read it. The question is, so what kind of different deployment tools are there? Well, that's kind of an invitation, I guess, to talk about our own tool, which we'll avoid. Suffice it to say, of course, we have a deployment tool, XL Deploy. There are a bunch of other commercial tools out there and free open source frameworks and tools out there. I think the one thing I might like to focus on at this particular point is different types of deployment tools, different approaches. There are two kind of main approaches to deployment tools out there if you go and have a look at the available spectrum. One is the sort of workflow approach, which of course I'm biased because we're not a workflow tool. I consider to be a little bit of a version 1 type of approach to this problem, but that's the classic kind of workflow canvas. You get this big empty sheet and you will draw exactly the process that you need to happen for this particular application to be deployed. And then the other kind of common approach is a more of a kind of model-driven or declarative approach where instead of describing the procedure that you want to be executed, you instead describe what you want the result to look like. So, I want these components running on these servers, or I want these Docker containers to have been instantiated in this particular Docker endpoint, or whatever. And then you let the system figure out, what needs to happen in order for that model to become real. So it's kind of the difference between, open the cupboard door, get out the slice of bread, put the butter on the bread, put the sandwich on put the ham on the butter, put another slice of bread on the ham. I can't even do this myself. Versus make me a sandwich. So that's, I think, again, as I said, I'm a little bit biased here. We can talk about that in more detail. I think the other big thing to look out for here from a technical perspective is agent versus agentless approaches. And this is true not just of deployment tools. This is true of all tools in this particular category. But a lot of tools are agent-based. That has a few advantages, of course, but largely I consider that to be, well, that was just where most of these tools came from technologically, from a history perspective. I think most of the modern ones that we see people are adopting more and more widely now try to be agentless because it just makes it so much easier to handle target platforms that don't rely on you having something running on a certain machine. Like, I want to call a Docker endpoint. That's an HTTP API. I don't need an agent running anywhere to do that. That seems a bit weird. And there are a bunch of other kind of technical benefits. There's a lot of information about that on our website, by the way. If you're interested in that particular trade-off, we have some technical research notes that will give you a kind of comparison of why we think this particular approach works well. But let me pick up another one. Right, that's an interesting one. Let's do that one. So, if I have a CI, on the one hand, so the question specifically is, I use my CI or provisioning tool to do deployments. What's the benefit of having a deployment automation tool? Okay, let me let me try to rephrase that a little bit. I mean, in the presentation we talked about, we talked about scenarios in which CI servers and provisioning tools can work for deployment, but by and large, why we see people having some challenges with that in certain situations. But then it's true, in the integration part of the slide deck that we walked through pretty quickly, I did mention CI servers and provisioning tools as very common integration points. And maybe I should go and try and clarify that a little bit, whether there's just a conflict here. And I think there's definitely no conflict whatsoever. I think in a successful and in a productive CI/CD kind of DevOps tool landscape, you will almost certainly have something that does, if you like, environment or machine provisioning, and you will almost definitely have a CI server. And so I think those tools very much belong in there, and they're great at what they do, and we use them, of course, in our own setup, and we love them to bits. But they're great at doing what they're good at doing and what they're really designed for doing. They're not so great if you try to extend them beyond what they're designed for and try to use them for everything else that you need to do in your CI/CD landscape. And specifically, CI servers are excellent at doing continuous integration, like doing stuff with code. Are not so good at doing deployments. But if you're using them to do stuff with code, it's a very natural integration to then say, okay, I've now finished doing my stuff with the code. Now I want to get this particular deliverable running somewhere so I can move on to the next phase in my pipeline, which is probably to put this thing through its paces in a more realistic environment. So I think that link up is very, very common and makes total sense and works excellently for the many tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people out there who are doing this. So yeah, definitely hooking up your deployment tool to your CI tool makes a lot of sense. Using your CI tool for the deployment itself, unless it's a very simple deployment like a one-line file copy or invoking an API or pushing a WAR file into, I don't know, Heroku, then I think you will start to see the challenges around that. And the other one, the provisioning tool, I guess, similar kind of story, but then in a different part of the tech space. Provisioning tools, you will almost certainly have them. And if you're moving to immutable infrastructure, maybe it gets a little bit different. But setting up a machine, starting with a blank image and turning it into a server that has a certain known state, and a versionable state, the state you can expect, that you can enforce. In other words, if somebody goes in and changes the file permissions on something, can I make sure that that is reverted? Provisioning tools are excellent for all that kind of stuff, because that kind of systems management area is what they were built for and also where they come from. So I think they have a very clear role to play in the overall CI/CD space. They're just not good at coordinating the application tier deployment that typically comes on top of the platform that you will provision with a provisioning tool. And again, you can architect your way out of this. If you write your systems in such a way that your database or your app server doesn't care about whether it's restarted before the database update has been applied or not, and it sits there and it'll just keep retrying until the database is in the correct state, then you can handle this lack of support for cross-machine orchestration pretty nicely, and arguably it's a good thing to do in your application anyway. But by and large, the vast majority of people we see out there don't have applications that are like this. And if they're thinking about designing new applications, then they're thinking about designing microservices anyway, which brings again with it the whole notion of interdependencies between individual services. And I think that the question of how microservices, so certainly containers, play with provisioning tools is a largely unsolved and interesting question that's still to be addressed. But suffice it to say, if you're using a provisioning tool for the provisioning part of things, you definitely want to link it up with anything that needs to know about the newly provisioned middleware, and that includes obviously your deployment tool. And that's why we, for example, XL Deploy has integrations with a whole bunch of provisioning tools, and a lot of our users use the combination of the two very effectively, and it works really well for them. I'm just looking at the time here. It's 1 minute to the hour, so I think I will skip the remaining questions and end with obviously, thank you very much for taking the time to join and to ask these questions. As I said, the recording will be made available afterwards. I'm sure you'll get a summary email. I'll also put the slides up on SlideShare so you can access them there. And if you do have any further questions, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody, for joining. And as Andrew pointed out, the recording will be available shortly. Thank you very much indeed. Goodbye.